Welcome to the second episode of this special three-part series of Chain Reaction, where I talk to experts about issues in migration and international security. I'm Clint Watts, a distinguished research fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. Special thanks to Aaron Stein for this opportunity. Today we've got Ian Urbina, director of the Outlaw Ocean Project, a nonprofit journalism initiative exploring lawlessness on the high seas. Ian recently published a piece in The New Yorker entitled "The Secretive Prisons That Keep Migrants Out of Europe." He uncovered human rights abuses taking place in migrant detention camps in Libya and the international systems enabling the continued operation of these prisons. So Ian, describe the migration situation in Libya to me. Has there been a nonstop current of migrants over the past decade, or is it more of an ebb and flow?
I think it is a nonstop flow. It has an arc to it. As I understand the data, the arc really starts on one side in 2010. It peaks 2015, and it's sort of dipped and leveled since then. In terms of sheer numbers that were crossing the Mediterranean and the Aegean, but the Mediterranean primarily, we're looking at 500,000 people in 2015, so huge numbers were washing ashore in Europe. We haven't seen those sorts of numbers since, and the numbers are not dropping precipitously, but they have dropped precipitously, and they're sort of leveled.
So where are they coming from, Ian, to get to Libya? Because Libya is not the easiest place to really get to, by land. I always found this curious. So why do they come to Libya as opposed to other countries, or is it somewhat, universal across all of North Africa?
It's a failed state, so its borders are porous. Egypt and Algeria are the other options, and those places have pretty tight border control. Libya's got a huge border. It's not super controlled. Historically, it wasn't meant to be. It was fairly decidedly porous. There was a sort of EU kind of free flow of people and commerce across many of these borders in Central and Western Africa. Furthermore, the part of the border that is Libya's southern border has a large strip of it that's right up against the desert. And that's another distinction that makes it more of a gateway. So for all those reasons, a lot of folks, be they Middle Eastern, especially during, Syrian outflow migration, but also sub-Saharan Africans from lots of places and West Africans come through this one corridor, through this town of Agadez and up through the main road that goes through the Saharan desert. It's the road of choice, or historically was until laws were changed, because it has the most water wells and kind of established history of traffic. And then they enter southern Libya, and there's just a sort of established pipeline of people moving up. Historically, again, under Gaddafi, a lot of these people were moving up that direction, not to launch across the Mediterranean, but to work in the oil fields. But everything changed after Gaddafi fell.
So it's really fascinating to me, Ian. In this case with Libya, we know it's a failed state, but from the perspective of the migrants, are they deliberately trying to get to Libya because they know it's a potential pathway, or is it just they're looking to escape from wherever they're leaving, and this is where they end up?
So you look at the main character in our story, Aliou Kande, 28-year-old farmer from Guinea-Bissau. He had initially gone to Morocco with an aim toward heading to Spain, partially because he had one brother in Italy and one brother in Spain. When he got to Morocco, he realized the cost of a trafficker's boat was what was too much. He couldn't afford it. So then he bumped over to Libya, where it's half the price. And Libya is attractive not just because of the prices are the cheapest, but the success rate is the highest, and that's for many reasons. There are more trafficker boats, and the distance is shorter. You're looking at a 150-mile trip roughly from Tripoli by water to the island of Lampedusa.
So, it's so curious, as I listen to you describe this, it very similar to other situations we see right now with Belarus and Poland, Mexico, obviously, and the caravan situation there. So, the understanding, of the migrants and the decision to jump is fascinating to me. Do you get a sense when you're talking to some of the folks that are in these camps or that you've encountered in this migration journey that they really understand the risk, or is it just there is no choice?
I think in broad brushstrokes, my sense is from the migrants we talked to that they had a vague notion of the risks. There's no way to conceptualize just how dangerous it is until you've been through it. And
Right.
people process and see what they want to see. And so the darkest, most brutal stuff doesn't get processed. And what does get processed is the rare success stories at the casino, and the jubilation of those who do make it to Europe and the money that gets sent back. So I think there is an awareness to some degree, but it's skewed.
Ian, I wanted to shift to the detention camps that you write about. What is going on with these detention camps? It almost feels medieval. Why are there these detention camps in Libya? Who's running them, and how does this whole system really operate?
But just to start on a sort of high altitude level, you have a situation here where you have tens and some years hundreds of thousands of people that are funneling from different places through and to Libya. They're launching into trafficking boats across the Mediterranean aimed at Italy or Greece or Malta or Spain. Um, there's a deep desire by the EU to stem this flow. And so the policy decision became, let's stem the flow further upstream. Let's choke it off before they're right at our doorstep. And that policy decision is the nature of the metaphor of the invisible wall that stretches across the Mediterranean. That wall is really policed metaphorically. It's run metaphorically by, if you think of it as a war on migration, there are three armed forces: a navy, an air force, and an army. The Navy is the Libyan Coast Guard. Libyan Coast Guard is not like any other Coast Guard on the planet. It faces towards Libya, not away from Libya. It's paid for, created, equipped, overseen by the EU. And it's at the behest of the EU. Its mission is to stop migrants from reaching Europe, but it's called the Libyan Coast Guard. The Air Force is Frontex. That's the border agency of the EU. And their role here is eyes in the sky, drones, airplanes, patrolling over the Mediterranean, spotting the migrant boats, calling the coordinates into member states, and then that gets handed over to the Libyans. Libyans then scoop up the people. And the on-land armed force, metaphorically, the army, is the collection of militias in Libya that really handle the migrants in the tens of thousands once they're returned to shore. And that's this system of a dozen or 15 official detention centers and then another 10 to 15 unofficial ones. These are prisons. They're typically warehouses. They're heavily armed. They're plugged into the central government, the UN recognized government in Tripoli, and they have ostensible oversight by the federal agency there. But really, the militia that runs the center calls the shots.
Am I understanding it correctly that the EU has essentially, we would say in the military, extended the perimeter, essentially pushed the migrant problem out of their borders or out of the Mediterranean Sea, and this is their solution for it, and they're partly culpable in it?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So you have a policy of wealthy Western nations that have decided to further southernize their border. So they're making a de facto border that's beyond their actual border. And the way they do this is they, number one, have smart people who think up policies that they can help get passed in these proxy states. And they say, okay, let's help change some rules, some laws, so that stems the tide further upstream. And then let's also arm the Border Patrol proxy force that we create to house and stop these folks further away from our border. The bigger factor is if you can stop them in these other places, you have a lot less challenge in terms of human rights groups and lawyers and journalists and all sorts of oversight that kicks in when they arrive onto our soil. And so it's just much more feasible to stop them there because it's less of a headache.
So, at the micro level, you tell the story of a migrant from Guinea-Bissau named Alu Kande. Hopefully, I said that right. What is his story, and how similar is his journey to many of the other folks that are stuck in these detention camps?
From what we can tell, it's prototypical. His story, Aliou Kande, 28-year-old from one of the poorest countries on the planet, Guinea-Bissau, farmer of cassava, yams, cashews, 2 kids under the age of 5 when he launches, wife who's pregnant. 2 brothers had already left, made it to Europe successfully, and he decides to head out. He follows a very standard path, which is through Niger, through the Sahara, and up through this main road up until he has to leave the main road with his trafficker because the main road has become criminalized by EU policies as part of this larger war on migration. Aliou eventually makes it to Libya, spends a couple weeks in Gargaresh, this migrant slum, finds the right guy to pay to get him in a boat with about 100 other migrants, make their run across the Mediterranean. Middle of the Med, they see a drone or airplane above surveilling them. Shortly thereafter, the Libyan Coast Guard shows up at gunpoint, takes all the migrants in what EU and Libyan officials might call a rescue, and I put those in air quotes. It's actually an arrest. These are folks that are not looking to be rescued in this way and taken back to hell on earth in Libya. They're taken back to shore and put in one of the biggest, newest, and most notorious of the detention centers, a place called Al Mabani.
Who are the groups that are operating these detention centers?
So the official centers, of which there are about a dozen, are under the ostensible control of a federal agency called DCI, Department of Combating Illegal Migration. It is a seeming authority. The truth of the matter is that individual militias run each center, each detention center, and that's based on where they are. And that's hugely relevant because to understand the flow of when a new boat of Libyan Coast Guard, a boat of 200 migrants gets scooped up at sea, brought back to shore, a call goes from the port to the DCIM federal authorities, and the decisions made as to what center to send them. This is a very sort of paternal kind of relationship-based system. So if you're part of the Zintan tribe, you're from a region in Libya, which is Zintan, and you're a Zintani, and you're working at DCIM, and your cousin who's a Coast Guard officer on the boat that just scooped those folks up, remembering that these are very profitable, captures. These migrants are worth a lot of money. So the Zintani cousin calls the guy in DCIM, and he says, take him to Mabani. Mabani is run by Zintanis. So they route the commerce to their relatives or regional compatriots. And that's sort of the network of how things flow. And Zintan is indeed the militia that run Mabani and have really good inroads in DCIM and on certain portions of the Libyan Coast Guard.
Is this a very, I don't know if is it historical or habitual sort of way things play out in Libya with these tribes and the communities that are there?
Yeah, I do think this is a chattel, system whereby humans are commercialized in an old school slavery sort of way, in the sense that, number one, they're captured and held against their will. Number two, they're monetized in multiple ways. One is through extortion. You catch the migrant, you put him in the detention center, you then keep them there. A week later, a guard approaches, says, here's a cell phone, call your loved ones, it's $500. And this is the extortion part of the business model. And it's very well documented. This is not a deviation from the norm. This is the norm. The second way where they're monetized is they're outsourced legally in Libya under Libyan law for forced labor in construction, in agriculture, women in prostitution. And the third revenue stream typically is skimming off of the aid dollars that are coming in from various sources to do harm reduction, to sort of try to make the plight of these centers and these people less bad. A small percentage of that money ends up going to the migrants, and the other percent goes towards the militias that run it. So these are the three main revenue streams.
If I understand this correctly, it would mean that if you're pulling from the international aid that's coming in, you would be incentivized to have more migrants in your system, correct? So in terms of this, Ian, where do we think things go from here? Is there really any policy mechanisms that can make things improved? It seems like, to a degree, the system you're describing, this has become an industry. And my experience has been the longer an industry is around, the harder it is to remove it. It becomes entrenched. As time goes on, do you think there are realistic, policy actions or options that are out there to sort of relieve this situation so we don't have a constant stream of migrants going into these detention camps?
I mean, I think that again, I'm prone to metaphors, forgive me that, but if you think of the war and you think of battles, on the altitude of is the war winnable and how can we win the war? I don't know. I'm down in the trenches. I can't talk like a general. I can't see the big picture. I don't know that I have an answer about the war. I think it's ongoing, this battle on these issues in Libya and elsewhere. There's a lot of folks within Libya, within the EU, fighting in different directions, and there's contestation over a lot of these policies, making it harder or easier for Doctors Without Borders to actually do humanitarian work on the water, squeezing the Libyan Coast Guard and saying, look, if you want all these toys and revenue, you better clean up your government's act over in the detention centers. Meta level shifts in policy, rather than $500 million going to arm guys in the desert with SUVs and weapons and Libyan Coast Guards and aerial drones and all this stuff. Maybe more revenue should be on the other side of the stampede and looking at the push factors that are driving Aliou Condé to leave Guinea-Bissau and putting more resources and thought towards how do we slow down at the source, not in transit or at the wall.
You were detained when you were in Libya. And I was wondering, first, why did they detain you? And then second, what was that experience like?
I run a small nonprofit organization that produces stories for magazines and newspapers. And I took a team to Libya. There were 3 other people and myself, all journalists. We had permission from the Libyan government to be there, had visas, and had help from an aid group to sort of handle the logistics on the ground. We're pretty open about the focus of our investigation, which was the detention centers and abuse of migrants. So from the get-go, the Libyan government was not super fond of us, but nonetheless, we had permission. We were having good success reporting, and on the 7th day, this was a Sunday night, and you don't travel around Libya as a journalist. You don't function in Libya and in Tripoli without armed security. So we had a security firm that was, taking us around. Got a knock on the door. My colleagues had gone out, again, in an armed convoy to a restaurant for dinner. I had work to do, so I stayed back, was on the phone with my wife, debriefing, and knock on the door. 12 armed men come in, hood me, put me on the ground, beat me pretty severely, break a couple ribs, and do other kinds of damage, and then drag me out barefoot and blindfolded, take me to a secret prison. My colleagues were similarly hit in the middle of an intersection on their way to dinner. Armed security pulled out of the car, pistol whipped, colleagues blindfolded, taken also to a secret prison, same location. And that began a 7-day captivity period. We were taken by something called the Libyan Intelligence Service, which again is a militia officially recognized of the federal UN recognized government. So this is the secret police essentially in Libya. To their explanation during day in, day out interrogation, our charges were 2. One was we were journalists, and the second was that we were spies, that I was running a CIA team and we were there to destabilize and embarrass the Libyan government. And at the end of 7 days in, isolation cells and pretty awful interrogation. They forced us to sign a 20-page confession document, all in Arabic, never told what it said until we got our hands on it later, confessing to our crimes, and then we were evacuated from the country.
I am sorry, that it is awful. How do you feel as a journalist now compared to a decade ago, as you took off on these adventures? Does it feel more hostile? Or has this kind of always been the case?
I have to say that I feel deeply mixed about even discussing it, because the truth is, as bad as what happened to us was, it pales in comparison to what tens of thousands of migrants are experiencing, and those folks are tortured and killed, and they don't have any government rescuing them. And so I even shudder to have any time focus on our captivity. I do think it was journalistically relevant because it gave me a small firsthand sense of the
Right.
impunity and the unpredictability and the violence of the very same system that's doing much worse to the migrants. So that gave me a little bit more of a visceral sense of how I could report on it.
That was Ian Urbina, journalist and director of the Outlaw Ocean Project. You can read his story, The Secretive Prisons That Keep Migrants Out of Europe, in The New Yorker, and more of his reporting at the website theoutlawocean.com. In the next episode, we'll discuss migrant caravans with Delphine Schrank, a freelance immigration reporter based in Mexico City. Delphine traveled with migrant caravans through Central America and will offer a glimpse into a migrant's journey to the U.S. southwest border with Mexico. This episode was produced by Sophia James and Sophia Curzius. I'm Clint Watts at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. You can follow me on Twitter at the username @SelectedWisdom. Thanks for listening.